Darren Dagger Malone, Lisa Red Hayes, and their ruthless crew turned Liverpool's streets into a battlefield, building the Scouse Cartel into the city's most feared and untouchable drug empire. This is the story of ambition, betrayal, and a criminal mastermind who operated in the shadows, leaving a trail of violence and secrets that no one dared to follow until now. Liverpool's waterfront had always been a hub of activity, the air thick with the smell of salt water and diesel, the sound of seagulls screeching above shipping cranes that reached like steel giants into the sky. To most people, the docks were simply a part of the city's rhythm, fishing boats returning with their catch, cargo ships unloading containers, and tourists wandering along the historic Albert Dock. But beneath this ordinary bustle, a hidden world thrived, one that the city's residents scarcely noticed. In the shadows of the warehouses and abandoned docks, a dangerous and highly organized criminal network was quietly taking root. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Scouse Cartel, Liverpool's most notorious drug empire. At first, the activities of the cartel seemed insignificant. Small-scale drug deals were dismissed by the police as isolated incidents. A few street-level dealers, a suspicious van parked in a dark alley, or an unexplained surge in overdoses, all easily overlooked in a city accustomed to petty crime. But these seemingly minor occurrences were only the surface of a highly coordinated operation. Unbeknownst to law enforcement, the cartel had already started building its infrastructure. The docks provided the perfect cover. Shipping containers arrived from ports across Europe, and hidden among legal cargo were shipments of drugs, carefully concealed and meticulously documented to avoid suspicion. Every delivery was timed precisely, with drivers who followed strict protocols, rarely deviating from their route. The network grew quietly, almost invisibly. The leaders of the cartel avoided public attention, instead communicating through encrypted messages and coded signals. Their enforcers moved through the city's neighborhoods with silent authority, ensuring that street-level operations ran smoothly. Residents in some areas began noticing unusual patterns: luxury cars parked outside dilapidated houses, strangers moving in and out at all hours, and a sudden increase in cash-only businesses. While the signs were there, most were too cautious or too fearful to investigate. It was not only the logistics that made the cartel formidable. It was the precision of its organization. Every member had a role, every shipment a purpose. Security was paramount. Surveillance cameras, once considered the eyes of the law, were often turned against anyone who might pose a threat. Spotters monitored the streets, warning of police presence, long before officers could intervene. The docks, with their maze of warehouses and container yards, became a fortress, a place where illicit activity could unfold with minimal interference. The atmosphere of the city began to change. Liverpool, known for its lively streets and vibrant culture, felt a subtle but growing tension. The docks no longer seemed like a neutral space. They had become the nerve center of a criminal empire that operated in plain sight yet remained almost untouchable. Residents whispered about shadowy figures seen at night, vans moving silently under the glare of streetlights, and the ever-present feeling that the city was being watched. Fear, quiet and pervasive, had started to take root alongside the cartel, leaving the community with the uneasy realization that something far more sinister than ordinary crime was emerging in the heart of Liverpool. At the center of the Scouse Cartel was Darren Dagger Malone, a man whose reputation was whispered in fear across Liverpool. Malone had not always been a criminal mastermind. Once he had worked as a bouncer in some of the city's busiest nightclubs, a job that had taught him both the value of strength and the art of intimidation. But beneath his calm exterior, there was a calculating mind, one that saw opportunity where others only saw chaos. He understood people, their weaknesses, their fears and their desires, and he used this knowledge to manipulate everyone around him, from street-level dealers to city officials. Malone's rise was neither sudden nor accidental. He began by controlling small territories, areas of the city that were neglected and under-policed. These neighborhoods became his testing grounds, where he established rules enforced by violence and loyalty. Those who crossed him disappeared for weeks, sometimes months, and rarely returned. Malone's methods were precise. He did not seek chaos for its own sake. Every threat, every punishment, every decision was a calculated move designed to solidify his power and expand his influence. By the time the cartel began to dominate Liverpool, Malone had already built a network that was sophisticated and hard to penetrate. Nightclubs and shipping warehouses were more than just legitimate businesses. They were fronts for laundering money and distributing drugs. The docks, which had long been a symbol of Liverpool's industrial past, had become the arteries through which his empire flowed. Vehicles loaded with narcotics moved through the city under the cover of legality, and very few suspected that beneath the routine of commerce lay a complex criminal operation. Malone's control extended beyond mere logistics. He created a hierarchy that was both feared and respected. Street-level dealers knew to follow instructions without hesitation. Enforcers operated like silent shadows, carrying out orders with precision. Even rival gangs recognized that challenging him directly was suicide. He had cultivated a reputation as untouchable, a man who could disappear at will and reappear at the most unexpected moment, striking with devastating effect. Yet it was not brute force alone that made Malone formidable. His intelligence and foresight were equally crucial. He had contacts across Europe, connections that allowed him to smuggle drugs efficiently while avoiding detection. He used encryption and coded language to communicate with his associates, creating a web of secrecy that confounded law enforcement. Police raids often failed because Malone anticipated them, diverting shipments and moving key members before they could be intercepted. Every move was planned, every risk calculated. Despite the violence and intimidation, Malone maintained a public image that was almost ordinary. To the casual observer, he was a businessman, a figure who seemed perfectly integrated into Liverpool's social fabric. This duality, both feared criminal and seemingly respectable citizen, was one of his greatest weapons. It allowed him to operate in plain sight, a ghost in the city who controlled an empire without drawing attention to himself. Liverpool's streets had changed under Malone's influence. Fear had become a currency, respect was mandatory, and loyalty was enforced with ruthless efficiency. Those who tried to question his authority quickly learned the consequences. Malone had transformed from a nightclub bouncer into the architect of Liverpool's most dangerous criminal network, and his rise was only the beginning. The city had not yet seen the full extent of his ambition, and the shadows of his empire were growing longer with each passing day. As Darren Dagger Malone's influence spread across Liverpool, the city's streets became a stage for a new kind of terror. Violence no longer belonged solely to the realm of petty crime. It had become a calculated tool of power. Rival gangs that once controlled small corners of the city now found themselves encroaching on territories ruled by the Scouse Cartel. Each challenge was met with brutal efficiency. Bodies began appearing in abandoned lots, behind warehouses, and even along the canals that wound through the city. At first, the disappearances were sporadic, almost random, but over time a pattern emerged. The killings were precise, sending a clear message. Any attempt to challenge Malone's empire would end in deadly consequences. The streets themselves became dangerous. Ordinary citizens learned to avoid certain neighborhoods after dark, not out of fear of random robbing, but because the cartel's enforcers could strike without warning. Shopkeepers found themselves paying protection money to ensure their businesses remained untouched, while residents whispered about men in dark vans observing their homes. Liverpool, a city once proud of its vibrant neighborhoods and strong community, was slowly being suffocated by a climate of fear. People no longer spoke openly about the cartel. Even mentioning Malone's name aloud could attract unwanted attention. What made the cartel especially terrifying was its invisibility. Malone rarely appeared in public, yet his reach extended to every corner of the city. Street-level operatives moved like ghosts, enforcing rules and delivering punishments with cold precision. Rumors circulated about a mysterious figure, the Scouse Shadow, who watched over Liverpool's streets, making decisions from the safety of hidden locations. Those who claimed to have seen him described a man who seemed ordinary, yet exuded a presence that could silence an entire room. The city's residents began to accept that the rules of everyday life no longer applied. They were now governed by an unseen hand. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to adapt. Police investigations were complicated by the cartel's careful planning and strict internal discipline. Witnesses were intimidated into silence, and informants disappeared without a trace. Surveillance operations often failed because Malone's network was constantly changing, shifting routes and tactics to stay one step ahead. Even when bodies were discovered, the cartel ensured that evidence led nowhere. The fear of retaliation created an invisible barrier that protected the cartel from scrutiny. Amid the violence, Malone's reputation grew. Stories of his ruthlessness circulated, blending fact and rumor. Allegedly, a rival gang leader was left in a canal for 3 days as a warning to others. In another incident, a shipment intercepted by the police mysteriously vanished before it could be seized, fueling speculation that Malone had inside contacts within law enforcement. Each act of intimidation and clever evasion reinforced his image as untouchable. The city's pulse had changed. Liverpool no longer felt like a safe harbor. It was a battleground where ordinary life existed only on the surface. Fear became the currency, and Malone's control was measured not only in money and drugs, but in the silent obedience of an entire city. The streets were scarred by violence, whispers, and suspicion, and even those who had never directly encountered the cartel felt its presence. Malone had transformed Liverpool into a city under siege, not from outsiders, but from a force that moved unseen, yet whose shadow loomed over every alley, every dock, and every quiet neighborhood. Within the Scouse Cartel, loyalty was a fragile commodity, and trust was a dangerous illusion. Darren "Dagger" Malone had built his empire on precision, fear, and control, but even the most disciplined organization was not immune to cracks. Among his closest associates was Lisa "Red" Hayes, a second-in-command, whose ambition and cunning had earned her a position of influence. She had proven herself capable and ruthless, yet beneath her loyalties simmered resentment. Red believed her contributions were undervalued, and she began to question Malone's decisions, quietly plotting to expand her own power. The seeds of betrayal often grew in silence. Red's discontent was carefully hidden, masked by outward obedience and a veneer of professionalism. She used her access to the cartel's operations to gather information, learning routes, shipments, and schedules. Every detail became a potential advantage. Meanwhile, Malone continued to expand his empire, unaware that someone so close was quietly undermining him. The docks, once a symbol of absolute control, were now the stage for subtle acts of treachery that went unnoticed until they could no longer be ignored. The cartel's internal tension mirrored the growing chaos on the streets. Rival gangs and law enforcement were pressing from all sides. Yet Malone remained confident in the loyalty of his inner circle. He underestimated the simmering ambitions of Red Hayes, a miscalculation that would nearly cost him everything. Her plans involved secretly communicating with a rival group, offering information in exchange for power, a move that could destabilize the cartel from within. If discovered, the consequences would be lethal, but Red was willing to take the risk. An intercepted shipment at the Liverpool docks became the first visible sign that betrayal was in motion. Law enforcement, acting on a tip from an anonymous source, uncovered evidence that pointed to internal leaks. Investigators found discrepancies in shipping manifests, encrypted messages that hinted at clandestine meetings, and surveillance footage showing unfamiliar faces near cartel operations. While Malone initially dismissed these signs as minor mistakes or police misdirection, the cracks within his empire were growing. Red's ambitions created a dangerous game of cat and mouse. She moved carefully, knowing that any misstep could result in her disappearance, a fate that had already claimed others who crossed Malone. At the same time, Malone's paranoia began to rise, as subtle inconsistencies in reports and missing shipments forced him to question his associates. The air within the cartel became tense, a silent battlefield where trust was no longer absolute, and even seasoned members began to doubt their colleagues. The betrayal threatened to unravel months of meticulous planning. Malone's empire was vast, but the strength of any criminal organization lies in its cohesion. Red's covert maneuvers exposed a vulnerability that outsiders could exploit, and for the first time, the cartel faced a threat from within that could not be solved by violence alone. In the shadows of Liverpool's docks and warehouses, a war of loyalty and deception had begun, and the outcome remained uncertain. The city itself remained unaware that the most dangerous battles were not always fought in the streets. While bodies and vans captured headlines, the quiet tension inside the cartel was far more perilous. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. Alliances could shift in an instant, and betrayal could emerge from the very people who once stood closest to Malone. The empire he had built with fear and precision was beginning to show its first cracks, and the consequences of that betrayal would soon ripple through the entire organization, setting the stage for events that could change the course of Liverpool's criminal underworld forever. The Scouse Cartel's wealth was staggering, and it flowed through Liverpool like an invisible river, unseen by most but felt in every neighborhood it touched. Baron Dagger Malone had built more than just a drug empire. He had created a financial machine that operated with meticulous precision. Money from street-level deals, bulk shipments, and hidden imports was funneled through a network of legitimate businesses. Nightclubs, warehouses, and small logistics companies provided perfect cover for laundering profits. Turning dirty money into seemingly lawful income, offshore accounts and shell companies added layers of secrecy, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to trace the full extent of the cartel's fortune. Malone's financial empire was more than a tool for personal gain. It was a weapon. With cash in abundance, he could buy loyalty, influence local officials, and ensure that his operations continued without interference. Street-level dealers were well paid, enforcers received generous bonuses, and even minor associates benefited, creating a system in which survival and profit were intertwined. Yet Malone remained distant from the money itself, rarely touching the bulk cash, instead delegating responsibility to trusted lieutenants. This separation insulated him from the risk of arrest and reinforced the perception that he was untouchable. The sheer sophistication of the cartel drew attention from authorities. The Metropolitan Police and local Liverpool law enforcement began noticing unusual patterns in financial activity and shipping schedule. Large deposits, luxury car purchases, and sudden investments in property suggested that a criminal enterprise was operating on a scale far beyond what had been previously assumed. National agencies were called in, and an investigation that spanned months was launched to trace the flow of funds and map the network. Operation Tide, as it was later called, became a high-stakes attempt to dismantle the financial backbone of Malone's empire. Yet, despite their efforts, Malone always seemed one step ahead. The cartel had developed its own security protocols for money management. Couriers moved cash in armored vehicles disguised as delivery trucks, and offshore accounts were layered with multiple aliases to obscure the trail. Encrypted messaging systems allowed lieutenants to coordinate shipments and manage finances without revealing sensitive information. Every attempt to intercept a transfer or monitor a transaction was met with sophisticated countermeasures, frustrating investigators and deepening the mystique surrounding Malone's operation. Even as law enforcement struggled, the streets of Liverpool reflected the tangible impact of the cartel's wealth. Areas controlled by the Scouse Cartel saw sudden economic booms. Shops thrived under protection payments, construction projects were financed by hidden profits, and luxury cars became a common sight. Yet beneath the surface, fear persisted. Residents understood that the wealth came at a cost, loyalty enforced through violence and intimidation, and a sense of uncertainty that no one could escape. The city had become a chessboard, with Malone's financial power as the most dangerous piece. Every move, every shipment, every bank transaction was calculated to expand his empire while evading capture. The combination of money, fear, and precision made the Scouse Cartel nearly impervious, a reminder that criminal empires could survive and thrive not only through violence, but through the silent, relentless force of wealth. Liverpool was no longer just a city, it was a playground for Malone's carefully constructed machine, one that few dared to challenge and even fewer could comprehend in its full scope. Lisa Red Hayes' ambition had always been dangerous, but it became deadly when she decided to act. Her resentment toward Darren "Dagger" Malone had grown quietly, hidden beneath layers of loyalty and competence. She had long felt undervalued, believing that her intelligence and influence deserved more recognition. Behind the walls of warehouses and nightclubs, Red began plotting a move that could have shifted the balance of power in the Scouse Cartel. Her plan was simple but risky: eliminate Malone's control and seize a portion of the empire for herself, leveraging her connections and inside knowledge to outmaneuver him. The moment of reckoning arrived on a foggy night in Liverpool's industrial outskirts. Red had coordinated with a Sol faction within the cartel, hoping to ambush Malone during a routine convoy. Vehicles loaded with narcotics moved through narrow lanes, unaware that betrayal had crept into their midst. But Malone, ever cautious and suspicious, had grown alert to signs of disloyalty. Even the slightest misstep by a subordinate could be fatal, and he had learned to trust patterns over people. What Red did not anticipate was that Malone had begun monitoring unusual activity within his inner circle, noticing subtle changes in loyalty and behavior. The ambush was catastrophic. Red and her accomplices waited in the shadows, tense and ready, expecting to seize control of the convoy. But Malone's network had already prepared for potential betrayal. A signal, simple yet precise, triggered the convoy to divert along a hidden route, leaving Red and her faction exposed. In the cold mist of Liverpool's industrial estate, the betrayal she had hoped would empower her instead led to her downfall. When the confrontation came, it was swift and merciless. Red Hayes was killed, her body left in a deserted section of warehouses, a stark warning to anyone who considered challenging Malone's authority. The incident sent shockwaves through the cartel. Members who had whispered about disloyalty now realized the deadly seriousness Malone's response. Fear escalated, spreading faster than any law enforcement warning. The internal discipline that had kept the cartel operating smoothly became reinforced through terror. Everyone understood that loyalty was absolute, betrayal lethal, and the consequences immediate. Red's death was not just punishment. It was a message, a vivid illustration of the cost of ambition within the empire. Law enforcement viewed the event with cautious optimism. They believed the failed ambush and resulting chaos might provide an opportunity to dismantle the cartel, assuming that internal strife would weaken Malone's control. However, Malone's ability to anticipate and neutralize threats showed the depth of his cunning. While Red's betrayal had momentarily shaken the organization, it also demonstrated Malone's ruthlessness and strategic foresight. The cartel's remaining members tightened their ranks, moving like shadows through Liverpool, maintaining operations while avoiding the exposure that could be exploited by police. Liverpool itself felt the ripple effects. Fear gripped neighborhoods even more tightly than before. Residents whispered about the price of betrayal and speculated on who might be next. The death of Red Hayes became a legend, a chilling reminder that within the Scouse Cartel, even the most trusted insiders were not immune to violence. Malone's empire remained intact, yet the shadows of that night lingered, a testament to the fragile balance of power, ambition, and fear that defined life under the Scouse Cartel. After years of operating in the shadows, Darren "Dagger" Malone and the Scouse Cartel finally drew the full attention of law enforcement. Authorities had pieced together fragments of the cartel's network, uncovering evidence of trafficking, money laundering, and extreme violence. In response, they launched a large-scale operation, codenamed Operation Tide, aiming to infiltrate the cartel and dismantle its operations from within. Weeks of planning went into the operation. Undercover officers were embedded as street-level dealers, warehouse workers, and even drivers. Their mission was to gather incontrovertible evidence of Malone's criminal activities while remaining undetected. Every move had to be precise. One mistake could cost lives. The operation began quietly, with law enforcement tracking shipments and monitoring financial transactions. Officers observed patterns, noting the arrival and departure of vans, shifts in warehouse activity, and unusual movements of high-value cash. Surveillance teams worked tirelessly, capturing images and recording conversations without revealing their presence. For months, the cartel remained unaware of the infiltration. Investigators grew more confident, believing that the culmination of months of work would finally bring Malone's empire to its knees. But Malone was no ordinary criminal. Years of experience had taught him to anticipate threats, even those hidden in plain sight. He had developed an extensive network of lookouts, informants, and encrypted communication channels that allowed him to stay several steps ahead of law enforcement. When Operation Tide began to close in, Malone noticed subtle disruptions. Unusual inquiries, unfamiliar faces, and discrepancies in delivery schedules. Recognizing the danger, he acted swiftly. Shipments were rerouted, key personnel were moved, and the operation's communication chains were altered to mislead any observers. What had appeared to be a perfectly timed sting began to unravel before it could fully strike. The undercover officers were now operating in increasingly hostile territory. Some were confronted by cartel enforcers in situations designed to test their loyalty and reliability. The fear of exposure grew with each passing day, and tension spread through both the law enforcement teams and the streets of Liverpool. Malone's ability to anticipate the sting created a sense of futility among officers who had hoped for a decisive victory. Months of preparation and risk seemed to vanish in an instant, leaving investigators to scramble for alternative strategies. Despite the failure of the operation, valuable intelligence was obtained. Authorities learned more about the cartel's distribution routes, financial networks, and methods of evasion. However, the frustration was palpable. The mastermind behind the Scouse Cartel had again proven untouchable. Malone's empire remained intact, his reputation enhanced by the audacity and precision with which he avoided capture. The streets of Liverpool, though briefly stirred by law enforcement activity, returned to their tense normalcy, a silent acknowledgement that the shadow of the cartel remained ever present. The near success and ultimate failure of Operation Tide highlighted the sheer sophistication of Malone's organization. It also reinforced the chilling truth that dismantling the Scouse Cartel required more than conventional policing. Liverpool's most notorious criminal empire had survived once again, and the city's residents were left to live under the invisible yet omnipresent influence of a man who had turned anticipation, fear, and meticulous planning into an unstoppable force. Despite surviving repeated police operations and internal betrayals, Darren "Dagger" Malone eventually vanished from Liverpool, leaving the city and law enforcement in a state of uncertainty. His disappearance was sudden and unexplained, occurring after years of meticulously running the Scouse Cartel with ruthless efficiency. Rumors circulated about where he might have gone. Some believed he fled the country, possibly to South America, maintaining connections with international networks that could sustain his empire from afar. Others speculated that he had gone underground entirely, living in anonymity while continuing to pull the strings of his empire without ever stepping into the public eye. The sudden absence of Malone left a vacuum within the cartel. His lieutenants, once operating under strict guidance and fear, were forced to make critical decisions on their own. Without the steady hand of their leader, factions began forming, each seeking to control territory and resources. What had once been a tightly organized network became fragmented, with former allies now competing for dominance. Violence escalated as smaller groups attempted to consolidate power, leading to turf wars that rivaled the previous chaos, but lacked Malone's strategic precision. Liverpool's streets, though quieter in some areas, became increasingly unpredictable as the empire fractured. Law enforcement found themselves in a complicated position. Malone's disappearance offered an opportunity to strike at a weakened organization, but the fractured factions proved difficult to track. The cartel's surviving members had learned from their leader, maintaining sophisticated methods of evasion and secrecy. Undercover operations and surveillance were now met with weariness and suspicion, making it clear that Malone's influence lingered even in his absence. The city remained under the shadow of an empire that no longer had a visible head, yet whose reach was still felt in every neighborhood it had once controlled. The psychological impact on Liverpool's residents was profound. Fear, which had once been concentrated in specific districts, now spread unevenly across the city. People were unsure who controlled which areas, which businesses were legitimate, and who could be trusted. The uncertainty created a new type of tension, one that was invisible but persistent. Malone's disappearance did not bring relief. Instead, it replaced fear of a single powerful figure with fear of chaos, betrayal, and unknown threats. The legacy of the Scouse Cartel had become embedded in the city itself, shaping behaviors, altering routines, and leaving scars that would endure for years. Even as fragments of the cartel were arrested or neutralized, the sense of Malone's presence remained. Whispers persisted about hidden bank accounts, undiscovered shipments, and loyal operatives still acting on his behalf. Investigators concluded that while the visible empire had crumbled, the underlying network of influence and fear continued. Liverpool had survived the reign of one of its most notorious criminal masterminds, but the city and its people knew that criminal empires of this magnitude never truly die. They evolve, adapt, and wait in the shadows, a constant reminder of the dangerous brilliance of the man who had once ruled from behind the scenes. Malone's disappearance became a legend, a story told in hushed tones among both law enforcement and those who had lived under the cartel's shadow. The Scouse Cartel, though fragmented, left an indelible mark on Liverpool, proving that fear, ambition, and cunning could create an empire that survived even in the absence of its leader. The city's past, present, and future were now intertwined with the legacy of a man who had mastered the art of control, leaving Liverpool forever changed.